In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Lord Jesus Christ, please send down your Spirit upon us. Give us your gift of wisdom, knowledge, understanding. Help us to know your plans for ourselves, and help us to come to know how we can best interact with this world of ours to bring your light to a world in need of your gospel. And let us be an instrument of your salvation. And let us pray together. Hail Mary, full of grace, the Lord is with thee. Blessed art thou among women, and blessed is the fruit of thy womb, Jesus. Holy Mary, Mother of God, pray for us sinners, now and at the hour of our death. Amen. In the name of the Father, the Son, the Holy Spirit. So the title of this is Put Not Your Trust in Princes, Hope and Despair in American Politics. This is originally, I gave parts of this at St. Gertrude, and it came about like this. It was that, so people always want to know your political affiliation, and so people will press you, and I would, if I really got pressed, I'd always back up with, well, politically, I'm an Augustinian. And I said it kind of as a quip, and also tell them to stop bothering me. But one of the friars at St. Gertrude, he said, well, what do you mean by that? What exactly do you mean when you say that? And that's the genesis of this talk, is what do I mean by saying that my political beliefs most deeply are Augustinian? And I think it's important because I think that St. Augustine has great insights into political reality. And so I want to lay out not policies or a platform or anything like that. What I find interesting about Augustine is his whole framework for understanding politics and what it is and what it can and can't do. And so that's what I want to give as a framework for understanding politics, not actual policy. Two side notes. First, this talk is aimed at Christians, so I want to give a Christian view of what politics is. I'm not going to shy away from revelation or theology or anything like that. I'm not trying to come up with some framework that someone who doesn't believe in God would also agree with. My goal is to give a Christian understanding of politics. And also, I'm going to talk about Augustine, but I'm not going to give an academic talk about St. Augustine. That would be very technical and boring. I'm going to talk about how I understand Augustine and how he's influenced the way I see these things. And one last note is that I use politics not in any technical sense of the word. By that I just mean our human efforts to live together, to solve common problems, to seek the common good, usually using the government, but not always. So I just mean politics in the widest common sense meaning of the word. So I don't have some hidden technical definition of it underneath this. It's just what we mean by the normal word. And I'm going to come out right at the beginning and say that the point of this is that the framework that Augustine gives us lets us understand the limits of politics. That politics cannot solve everything, and in fact, it cannot even solve the things that we care most deeply about. That's, I think, a really important point for a Christian understanding of politics, are the limits of politics and political action. All right, I'm going to start at a strange point. I'm going to start with a statement that I usually like to say because it shocks people, but there's a deeper point to it. And it's this, that the problem with communism is that it's too moderate. That it's too moderate of a theory. Because if you think about it, what do communists believe? That if you rearrange our economic and political structures, if you even change them dramatically, but really it's all changes in political and economic structures, and if you change those in the right way, then we can solve all the world's problems and bring about some sort of utopian vision of the future. And the assumption underneath there is that all our problems at root are economic and political. And if we just change our economics and our politics, everything's going to be hunky-dory. The problem with that is that it's not true, that our problems are in fact deeper than simply the way we structure our economic system or the way we structure our political system. It's a shallow view. And you can see it doesn't work because every time communism has been tried, what does communism do? It turns everything into politics. Everything's political in a communist system. And even when they make politics everything, they've still not managed to bring about any sort of utopia whatsoever. Instead, they've left about 100 million people dead. So they've pretty much failed to do what they promised to do, which shows that politics alone is not enough. You could say the same about any other political utopian system, such as fascism or any of the others. And there's a reason for this, and the reason is that the problems facing mankind are simply deeper than politics and economics. So what are these problems facing mankind? Well, I mean, just read the newspaper. You can see in the news any day you read it, what war, poverty, violent crime, fraud, theft, corruption, greed, racism, bigotry, sexual harassment, consumerism, manipulation, addictions. I mean, the list goes on and on and on of what you just see in the newspaper every day. Or you go to a personal level, that the confusion about what does it mean or how does one find happiness? Why are so many people not happy? Why is self-reporting of loneliness so high in the modern world? Why do you see alienation, isolation, suicide, euthanasia, abortion, depression, on and on and on? So even on the personal level, there's clearly something awry. We all seek happiness, but it seems to be so elusive to so many people. I mean, that's why you see throughout, if you go to a bookstore and you look in the self-help section, or all the gurus in the culture, or all these people that seem to have the answer, but it never quite pans out. And this isn't just our day and age. It's not unique to modern America or the modern world. This is true throughout all of human history. I like to listen to blogs. Before I go to bed, I'll listen to audiobooks or blogs. And I had this one I was listening to, and it was a history of the English kings. And it went from whoever might have been King Arthur up to the modern Queen of England. And it was just going to go through the history of them all. So I was listening to them, and I stalled out around the 12th century because I just got bored, because it turns out, at least in this blog series, they were all awful people. It was all how they tried to subjugate, conquer, control, manipulate, oppress all the people under them and spread their domain so they could oppress even more people in a wider area. And it just got so repetitive, hearing one tyrant after another. And I'm like, I just give up. I don't even want to know about the next 1,000 years. It's not that the world was perfect at some previous time and now it's bad. This has been the state of human affairs since Adam and Eve. So, well, what's going on then? Well, it's not a question of structure. It's not that the English kings couldn't structure the realm correctly. If it was just structure, then sometime in the last 100,000 years, someone would have figured out the right mix of economics and politics to get it right. But we seem to be no closer now than we were 1,000 or 10,000 years ago. But the one constant in all of that, and all of that history, the one constant is us. It's that they're all human societies, and they're all human problems we face. So that the real issue, the real problem is within us. It's a problem on the level of our humanity. And this is something that modern politics doesn't want to talk about, and it often has a naive view of. I mean, modern politics and political commentary, they're squeamish at talking about souls or evil. Like whenever you see evil in the news, if someone actually uses that word, it just means I really, really disapprove. But it doesn't have any deeper sense behind what evil truly is. Everything seems to be reducible in political commentary to policy or procedure or technique or technocracy, some sort of technocratic solution. And the reason they want to leave it at the level is because they don't want to look into the depths of our own humanity, the depths of the problem we face. And there's a reason why our politics is shallow today. It's not an accident. I'm going to give a real short, overly general history of why it's like that now. For more deeper view, I recommend The Unintended Reformation by Brad Gregory, a history professor out of Notre Dame. It's The Unintended Reformation. Great book. But the way it starts, the reason why modern politics is shallow, that the framework for understanding politics is shallow, it really goes back to the Protestant Reformation. Because once you had a split between Catholic and Protestant countries, it led to huge wars of religion. You eventually had the 30 Years' War, which ended in a stalemate and the devastation of Germany. And there was no desire to keep on fighting over these religious issues. And so people looked for a different level of agreement within societies, something besides religion that people of both sides could agree on. And so that tended to be the things of this world: money, power, economics, things like that. Like, well, he might be a Protestant, I might be a Catholic, but we both agree on how much taxes the state's taking in and how the structures of government are. So let's talk about that and let's sideline this religion issue. And that was, over centuries, became the path that led to a secular government, where the way it eventually came to be is that on a societal level, we're not going to talk about the deepest questions. We're not going to talk about what the end of human life is or whether there's a God or not. We're going to talk about what everyone can all agree on. But the problem is it made politics shallow. It meant that the public discourse couldn't talk about deeper issues. It was tied to these things that everyone could agree upon. And there was an illusion that somehow that made government neutral between all the sides. That the individual, you can personally have whatever higher belief you want. When the government, we're going to deal with common agreements. But the problem was that the problems is that you could publicly frame them and deal with them on a public policy level were all based upon a secular worldview. But what if that secular worldview wasn't deep enough or even correct to see the problems facing society? What if all the problems couldn't be solved by simply technocratic or secular solutions in policy? What if the whole framework of secularism, the lens of it, was warped? Then the way it frames problems and the way it responds to problems will be warped as well. Additionally, because it's only dealing with secular issues, then that means that the secular political issues, those are things within human control. I mean, politics is human action on a community level, but it's still human action. And so that means the world's going to be seen in terms of the things that we can change as human. And so in terms of things that are within our control. There's no room within that framework for divine things or for God. And so it gives the illusion that every problem is acceptable to a political solution. The politics can apply to everything because those realms beyond human control we don't talk about anymore. This leads to utopian politics, such as communism, that everything's within our control. That's how we got here, put very, very briefly and crudely, but it's much more complicated than that. But that's how we got to the point where everything's seen on this shallow political secular level. But I've still been skirting the issue of, well, what is the root of the problems that we face, that we try to deal with as a community? What is a deeper cause that the secular framework misses? Because we all see the consequences, the evil in the world, the things that everyone agrees are a problem, but we don't see the root of all that, the deepest issue. And it's this, is that there was a cosmic disaster at the beginning of humanity. Now, of course, I'm talking about original sin, the fall of Adam and Eve. And if you remember that account from Genesis 3, you have Eve, and Adam and Eve have both been given one command by God, that there's a tree of the knowledge of good and evil, and they're not allowed to eat from that tree. And the serpent comes up to Eve, and the serpent says what to her? He says, "Did God tell you that you can't eat from any of the trees?" But that's a lie, because you remember the devil, the serpent said to her, God said to her, there's only one tree you can't eat from, but the devil said that he tell you can't eat from any of the trees. The implication is that God has put you in this apparent paradise, but he's not allowing you to eat any of the trees. That if you follow what God says, you will starve. That God doesn't have your back. And also there's a pride there on Eve's part, because there's a thought that, because in the serpent pushes us when he says you can be like God, well, there's that pride that yes, I can be like God, that I don't need to rely on God, that I can take things into my own hands, I can eat of this tree, I'll have the power of God, I'll be like God, I can make my own rules, I can take care of myself, and I probably should because God doesn't have my back, I'll starve if I follow him. So you have this fear and you have pride both going together. Those two always go together. But you have them going together at that moment of the temptation of Adam and Eve. And of course, they eat. Both Adam and Eve eat of the fruit. And that marks all of us to this day, this pride and this fear. Also, and it's interesting that That's exactly the secular view, is that everything's susceptible to politics. Well, that's the pride that we can be like gods, that everything's within our control, and also that we don't talk about God. Well, that's a sense that also that God's not relevant to our discussion. So both of those elements of that temptation mark secularism. Also, when Adam and Eve fell, they had rejected God by rejecting his rules. They rejected the basis of their friendship with God, and they lost. First, they were exiled. They were kicked out of the garden. That means that their relationship with God was severed, which led to an internal disorder within their own souls. And they lost the gift of grace that God had given them. That gift went with the friendship and was lost when they rejected that friendship. And that had consequences for Adam and Eve that mark us today. That what Adam and Eve did affects us because we're their children. So first, it led to a darkening of their minds, that they no longer saw as clearly as they did before. That whenever we commit sin, it in some way blinds us, and we start with that blindness from our own ancestors. That's why we're so confused, and so many people are confused about what leads to happiness, how to find fulfillment and joy in life. And it's unique to humans. I mean, dogs don't have existential crises. They don't wonder how they're going to get through their day or how they're going to find fulfillment. I mean, a dog bone's about good enough for a dog. I mean, it marks us as beings with souls, and souls that are also wounded by sin. And that's why we don't know automatically the meaning of our lives, or even why we always act the way we do. And it also means that we don't know how to fix the brokenness in our own lives or on a cultural level. Another effect of the fall is the corruption of the will, where we seek happiness in all the wrong ways. We often want things that are bad for us. You just look at, my favorite example of this is Anthony Weiner, who tried to run for mayor of New York and couldn't stop sexting and destroyed his career. He should have known it's the dumbest thing in the world to do. It's going to come out, but he couldn't stop himself. And you see this self-destructive behavior all the time among humans. Or even when we know it's wrong, we fail to have the willpower to avoid it anyway. Or we rationalize and lie to ourselves. We say it's okay when we know it's not. Or we get upset at others when they don't accept our rationalizations. You see this really in the gay rights lobby, where when people don't accept what they say, their goal is to silence them. It's not unique to them, but you see it throughout, that this attempt to silence anyone who disagrees, especially when the basis of their argument is a lie. That desire to control others, Augustine calls it the libido dominandi, the desire to enforce our will upon others and upon the world. And that marks our humanity. That's why all that English king blog was so boring. It was kings attempting to force their will on everybody they could. And we see these things whether we're Christian or not. We see that there's something really wrong. And political ideologies such as communism see it as well. What they get wrong is the answer, because they have the wrong framework for analyzing the problems. I say all that to say that politics is embedded in a wider understanding of the world, that politics have a wider frame than simply their policy, a frame with which they use to formulate their policy, and that secular politics fails to see the limitations of its own secular approach because of the shallowness of its framework in seeing the world. Because if political procedures and economics really is the root of our problems, then secular politics would have worked, such as communism. But if this Christian approach, this crisis at the beginning of humanity is the case, then secular politics will fail to understand the human situations and the problems that face humans, such as man's alienation from God. Well, if that's the root of our problem, which it is, that's not something we can fix on our own. That it takes God to repair our relationship with God. That's what Christ was. He was the bridge. In his humanity, he came to earth, while in his divinity, he was anchored in heaven, and being on both sides can renew man's relationship to God. It took the God-man to fix that problem. That we couldn't do it on our own, because if we could, then the Tower of Babel would have worked. Then the problem with the Tower of Babel wouldn't have been, in principle, that we can't save ourselves, but that the people back then didn't have enough technology. That instead of building a ziggurat, if they could have built a sleek skyscraper, it would have worked. But that's essentially what communism's claim is that we can bring human perfection because now we have the technology of Marxist theory. So it sounds absurd put that way, but it is absurd from God's point of view. Because ultimately, all politics, it's human work. It's our effort together as a people united in a community. And so it can only achieve the things that we're capable of achieving as humans. But if the deepest root of our problems is our relationship with God having been severed by Adam and Eve, no amount of humans, either individual or community, can overcome that. So that means that the deepest problems we face as humans can't be met by politics. That doesn't mean that politics is irrelevant or unimportant, but we can't ask from it things that it's incapable by its very nature of solving. So I've gotten this far, and I haven't really mentioned Augustine yet. So I want to introduce Augustine here because I think he's uniquely valuable today for this reason, that he wrote this massive work called The City of God. He even said himself from the beginning that it's a great and arduous book. So it's a real achievement if you manage to go cover to cover in it, although I'd recommend it. But one of the key points of his argument throughout that is a critique of the classical culture, the classical Greek and Roman civilization. And what he was critiquing was the understanding by the ancient Greek and Roman pagans that the city, and for them the city meant the country, can meet all of man's needs, that it was self-sufficient, that a properly run city can be everything that humans need it to be. And he was critiquing that, saying, no, they can't, because they don't include God, that man needs more than the type of civilizations that we can produce by our own efforts, that more is needed than simply human politics. We need God and therefore a church as well. And so that's exactly the critique I'm making here of secular politics. I'm getting it right from St. Augustine. So let me give a real nutshell view of how Augustine understands politics within the city of God, because I think it's just as applicable today as it was to the late Roman Empire in his time, because it explains the full cosmic dimensions of the situation we find ourselves in. All right, so he sets up two cities. There's the city of man, and this is the society we see in the newspapers. It's the society I was listening to in the blogs about English kings. It was a society that Augustine saw in the late Roman Empire. It's a world marked by corruption, crime, manipulation, et cetera, where people strive against each other, that they see their rise to power by throwing other people underneath them, that there's rivalries everywhere, that everything's a matter of struggle and fight, that injustice abounds. Augustine famously said that in kind, and there's no real difference between a band of thieves and Roman emperors, because neither of them reflect true justice. So the city of man is man and his fallenness, and the society he constructs as a fallen creature. And they see the world through the lens of vice. And the core of it, what makes it what it is, both the city of man and the city of God, is love. Augustine famously says that our love is our weight, that we become what we love, that our love determines the sort of person we are, that it drives us where we're going. That's why it's our weight, that it's our love that leads us. And so what matters most to us as humans, what sort of human we are, is what do we love the most? So what's our bottom line in life? If you were to lose one thing after another till you were left with one thing you loved, what would that be? Because that's what you love the most, what you would give up last. It becomes a justification of all your actions. What you love the most can justify everything. So say, for a bad example, say you have two people in love, but one of them's married to someone else. They'll say if what they love the most is that romantic love between each other, then it will justify breaking a family. That if what you love the most is not actually the highest good, love of God, it'll lead you to evil. This is the thesis of C.S. Lewis's The Four Loves, that any love for a thing in this world, that if that's your highest love, it becomes a demon. That it's an idol that becomes a demon. It goes astray. And that's also what Dante's one of his main points in his Divine Comedy is as well, is that our love for the things of this world only work properly when we love God first. Well, the city of man are all the people who love this world above God. And that's their fallenness, is because they're not rightly ordered in their loves, that the highest justification for their actions isn't actually the highest justification. And so it leads them astray. And they're never satisfied because our hearts are made to rest in God, as Augustine says in the Confessions, that his heart was restless until it came to rest in you, O Lord. That we'll never find what we're seeking when we love something before God. It's like it becomes insatiable. It's like eating Pringles, that you eat one and you somehow like it but are not satisfied all at the same time and have to have more and more. Or like when you scratch poison ivy and it doesn't do you any good, but you still can't stop scratching. You know, that's what love for the things of this world is like. It's not that they're bad. A Pringle's good, but it's just not enough. And we strive for more and more. And so that leads people ultimately into injustice and futile attempts to seek happiness because they're not finding the happiness they're made for. So that's the city of man. And then you have the city of God, and that's centered on love of God first, when all loves are rightly ordered within the people's soul, that true justice is possible because unity is possible through the love of God. It's a charity that unites that society, that there's charity between people instead of rivalry and sin between people. It is a utopian society, and it's only realized in heaven, that the real city of God is only seen in its fullness in heaven. It's not going to be seen that way on this earth. We can see it in part here through Christians who live a life of charity, but we only see it in part. Its fullness is only in heaven. And it's really, you can see it on earth as a place of asylum for the sane people in a world that's an insane asylum. That's one way to look at it, as G.K. Chesterton put it. Now, ever since Christ, the whole dynamic of all cultures are the dynamic of these two cities in interaction. This is his explanation for it. And the way it works is that everybody faces the temptation that Adam and Eve faced in Eden. That do we want to be our own gods, or do we follow the true God? Do we trust in God, or are we to fall into pride? Do we believe in God in hope, or do we fall into fear? That everyone will face that original temptation. And how we answer that determines which city we belong to. Is the center of our soul pride, or is it charity? And that will determine our happiness. Now, a couple notes on the interactions. These are not earthly cities. So you can't say that Cleveland is a city of man and Columbus is a city of God. That these are mystical cities. They're all mixed up on the earth. Just like Christ says that the wheat and the tares won't be separated until the end of the time. That they're all mixed up. They're mystical cities, not physical earthly cities. And they won't be separated until the second coming and the final judgment. So it's all going to be mixed up. Also, the city of God is not the institutional church. It's those bound together who, by their charity, is their highest part of their soul. But the institutional church is the body of Christ, but not everyone in the institutional church, not all the baptized, love God first. Judas, an apostle, betrayed Christ. So right at the beginning, you have someone who was a member of the body of Christ, but not the city of God, because he loved something more than Christ and thus betrayed him. And so we can't even say which city we're in, because our motives are often mixed. We're not even good judges of our own soul. So we're to struggle to put God first, but it'd be presumption to say, well, I'm certainly in the city of God. I know I'm holy. If you say that to yourself, you need to spend more time praying over your conscience. Some people, you can guess, are better off. I'd rather be Mother Teresa than a gangster, but you know what I mean, that our motives are often unknown to ourselves even. So what does that mean for politics? How does Augustine say anything about politics? I mean, he's thinking about the late Roman Empire, but I think his Christian framework helps. It shows that countries, governments, cultures change, but the underlying dynamic ever since Christ came is similar. It manifests itself differently, but it's similar. Every culture is a mixed culture. There's no perfect culture. There's no completely evil culture, but it's a mix between those who belong to the city of God and the city of man. And also that we cannot change that. That it's up to Christ when he returns to separate the wheat and the tares, the sheep and the goat. That we don't do that ourselves because we're not the judge. We can't see into people's souls, even our own. Also means that utopian politics are false because it's taking Christ's prerogative for ourselves. It's making us the judge of what's the city of God and what's not. That all utopian politics, where we bring about utopia, are rooted in a pride of taking God's place and becoming the judge of this world and of human souls. Also, what's central is not the system of government or its procedures or its politics, but what the culture of that country or city loves. The love of the culture is what's determinative. So ultimately, the laws of a country will reflect what that culture loves. If you have a culture marked most deeply by greed, then ultimately its laws will reflect that. If you have a culture marked by corruption, its laws will reflect that. If you have a culture marked mostly by charity, its laws will reflect that. That what comes out of the political process depends upon the input. And what the input ultimately is what is the heart of the people in that culture? What do they love the most? And that's going to be most determinative. Also, that this, as a Christian framework, it will be denied by many. But we need to live in the truth, even if some refuse it. Because the people in the city of man aren't going to like this analysis. But it's important not to always find some system everyone can agree to, but to seek the truth of the matter. Also, to change society, if we want to change our society or any society, what matters the most is to change what people love. And that means conversion. That ultimately the most effective element for changing our world would be to bring about and further the new evangelization. Not that that's primarily about politics. It's about something more important than politics. New evangelization is about working for the salvation of souls. But by converting people, that will downstream lead to political change because it will change the culture by changing what people love most. Also, that if love is what's central in determining a culture, then we can't just appeal to the head. That apologetics is not enough. We have to appeal to the heart. We have to draw people in love. That means that art, beauty, nobility, excellence are as important or more important than apologetics and arguments, especially art. And what's going to be most central is the witness of Christian love. This is what changed the ancient Roman Empire, that they saw that there was something different about Christians, especially how they loved their wives and how they didn't leave their kids to die of exposure if they didn't want them, how they loved the poor. The Romans had no notion of charity as we have it. They would just say, well, some people were born to be slaves. That's just how it is. So let them die in the mines. They didn't think twice about that. Or some kids are meant, we didn't need them, we'll just let them die of exposure. It wasn't a big deal for them. But they saw how different the Christians were, that they loved even the poor. Husbands actually loved their wives and didn't just divorce them whenever it was convenient. That something was different was at work. And that drew people because they were attracted to that charity. They said, I want to be a person that can love like that. And so Christianity spread like wildfire in the ancient world because they saw that a new power had come into the world. The Romans understood as well as anyone coercion, oppression, manipulation, raw power. They knew these things. They had conquered the largest empire in the world. But what they didn't understand was love and the new power that had entered the world with Jesus Christ. And that changed everything. The city of man, it understands power, but it doesn't understand charity. And it has great resources to fight anyone who threatens it on the level of power, but no defense against charity. Charity shows a way out of the fallen world, a way that answers to people's deepest desires. And that's why it draws people, and it moves hearts and changes everything. All right, what about hope and despair. That's the subtitle of the talk, so I should probably say something about hope and despair. Hope comes from God. That's kind of the point of this, that we can't place our hope in politics, because to say our hope is in politics is to say that our hope is in our own human efforts, which are never sufficient, that our deepest problem is our alienation with God and the effects from originally being alienated from God. To say that our hope is in our own efforts is to say that we can save ourselves, that to fix our deepest problems we need God. And because politics is by its very nature only deals with human problems and human actions, it means that politics can never solve our deepest problems. Something more is needed. That our deepest hope and happiness will never be fulfilled simply by politics. Even if we're successful in whatever political ambitions we have, we can't see those as the end of our life, what will bring us ultimate happiness, because human action alone never can. That if we hope in the world and the power of this world, we're setting ourselves up for despair, because we're made for more than this world, and our hearts yearn for more than this world, even what we can achieve in it. Also, that if you don't have a notion of God, then you have no choice but to place your hope in this world or fall into total despair. And that secular move to hope in the things of this world, to hope that politics can solve the deepest of human problems, it's really at the root of the lack of civility in political discourse. Because think of it, if politics is everything, if you believe that politics can bring about true justice in the world, then politics becomes everything. Politics becomes the highest love, the highest notion of our identities of ourselves. And so all politics becomes a matter of total war, because everything is on the line. That salvation, even your own identity, is at stake, because now politics is invested with everything. This is why you can see the 100 million dead people in the 20th century under communism and fascism. Because if the ultimate, what we love the most, justifies everything, then if your love is to bring about your own idea of a political utopia, that will justify anything you do. And that's why we see so many dead people, because if politics is everything, then politics is necessarily a game of total war. In fact, politics then becomes like a secular religion, because it's the highest of everything. There's nothing to contain politics or limit it or to judge it by. It's the highest of everything. That's why we see a push against free speech, because people who speak against your political position, they're not people who disagree with you politically. If politics becomes a secular religion, then they're heretics, and they need to be silenced like heretics. That you see this in the moral language used in politics often, where political opponents are not someone that I have an honest disagreement about the best way to solve a problem, but they're evil, and we must attribute evil motives to them. That it's not that we've come to a different calculation of the best thing to do, but he only disagrees with me because he's an evil, awful, terrible person. Well, if that becomes the way we see things, then no civility is possible in political discourse. And if politics is everything, then there's no deeper foundation for human dignity that can say, hey, wait a minute, this is just a political disagreement. There's nothing higher that can judge it in that way. What did in the past was the shared Christian framework in this country. But that's, the fumes of that are burning off in this country that would keep politics in check, because we saw that people from a shared Christian framework have a human dignity even if we disagree with them on important political matters, that there's deeper principles in the politics of the day, that we have to respect each other regardless of our disagreements just because of our shared humanity. In other words, that we should love rather than hate, as Christ commands us. What we need to do is to give a world a new hope, that there is something higher than politics. There is a founded hope rather than the dead end of secular politics. So how should a Christian conduct politics? What does it mean on a more practical level? Well, if you're going to conduct politics, first know its limits. Don't get invested in hoping for something that's impossible to politics. Know what it's capable of and what it's not capable of. Don't place your ultimate hope in it. If you place your ultimate hope in politics, even if you win, you really lose, because it can't save you in an ultimate sense. Now, we should do what we can politically, but we need to trust in God and not just in men. The trust that providence, God's providence, is what brings salvation. And that gives us freedom, because it takes a huge weight off our own backs. The salvation of the world doesn't depend on us having the politics we want. That it's in God's hands, not ours. And that gives us a freedom not to have to live under the weight of producing our own Tower of Babel that actually works, even though it can't. That we don't need to save the world. It's not our role. It's God's role. And God will. And then we can place our hope in God and have the freedom to do what we can without that pressing weight of having to become a savior. We also, in politics, we have to point to deeper truths, such as charity and respect for others, respect for human dignity, because what we seek as Christians is conversion. While a politics of total war seeks total destruction of the enemy, as Christians, our enemy is not other humans, even if they're our political enemies. Our enemy is sin and death and evil, not people. Our goal is to convert people. That's why the new evangelization of changing hearts it has to be at the core. And because we seek to love even those who hate us, we can hope for their conversion. We can show them a different way than a politics of total war, a deeper dignity, truth, a deeper framework to all of politics than simply raw power. Really, the bottom line is this, that if we want to change the world, we need to be saints, because it's that God working through us. It's God turning us into people like Christ that brings real change. It's the Holy Spirit acting through us that brings about conversion and salvation. And the real win is winning souls for Christ, because that's the deepest win, that's the deepest utopia, is a life of eternity. And so our hope really needs to be in Christ. We don't need to put that weight on ourselves. But if we hope in God and we always seek to do the good and we love our neighbor, then we'll truly win people for Christ. And that's what really matters. Thank you. All right, everyone, let's do some questions. This is the most fun part, because I get to hear other people talk. So anyone want to lead us off with a question? We got to have at least one question. Yes.
It's really not so much a question, Father. It was just an observation when you were talking about the fact that the Romans couldn't value an unwanted child or a person in poverty, and that they admired the charities in the Christian population. It seemed to me as though there was always, even in the most corrupt societies, if it's the South with slavery or if it's the Romans with their treatment of people, that in the corrupt culture there still is this underlying percentage or part of every person that wants that better life and responds to that. And that's what struck me as being so amazing. And I don't know if you want to make any more statements on that.
Well, sure. Evil is a privation. It's something missing that should be there. So you could think if you order a cheeseburger and there's no cheese on it, you're like, wait, I was supposed to have cheese here. Something's missing that should be there. Evil's always that way. So evil, properly speaking, doesn't exist. It's an absence of what should exist, which means that when people become corrupted, they lose parts of their own humanity. They become smaller and smaller, metaphysically even. But they can never go to zero because they would no longer exist. Meaning that no matter how evil someone gets, there's some core of him that's still alive and open to the truth, even if he consistently refuses it. There's some part of him that drawing him towards God, and there's an opportunity always in this life for conversion. Even Darth Vader at the end. Sorry. Yeah. Other questions? Right, well, there and there.
I was just kind of curious about your comment the current political environment, I don't think I've ever seen more hatred in my life. And I was just kind of curious if you think things have come to a head, or if there's room for even more divisiveness and hatred.
I don't know. Things can always get worse. I mean, I think we're seeing right now in American politics, we're seeing two sides with very, very different worldviews that are seemingly irreconcilable on many levels. And the question is going to be, are we going to find a way in the near term to live together, or is it going to be fought as a war of total warfare to the destruction of one side over another? Such as you have after Roe v. Wade, where you have an ability for the two sides to live with each other, even though they disagree with each other. Is it going to be like that, or is it going to be like something else where the other side was totally destroyed? I think as a country, our strength has always been in finding ways to live with each other. From the earliest days as America, we had America and the 13 colonies had very different cultures, very different histories, very different types of people, and they found ways to live together. So I have hope that even now that our American culture can accommodate serious and deep disagreements and still come out as a way to live together. I mean, I hope that's how it turns out. But the ultimate answer is a conversion of hearts of many people. But in the near term, can we find a way to live together, to respect each other as people worthy of dignity, regardless of our political views?
We need to use this.
So they can't hear you on the radio.
Oh, okay. You spoke earlier about the fact that that people kind of reached a point where they couldn't really agree on religion or the focus on religious life and who God is and things like that. So they set that all aside. Mm-hmm. You said that earlier on, and set that aside and focused on the things that the earthly things, mm-hmm. About money and power and that kind of stuff. But wasn't that at least to some extent attempted to be reconciled through the founding of our country and the Constitution? The fact that we would focus on a system of government and system of economics and so on, but to preserve the freedom of religion, so that whatever your religious beliefs are, you would not be either held up by government or held down by government. Wasn't that the whole point?
Well, I think that America has managed that better than just about any other country, to keep that ability for people with different fundamental views together through the freedom of religion and whatnot. We'll see how that continues going forward, the First Amendment rights, but I agree that America was uniquely successful in implementing that sort of agreement. But you do see elements, where there's not the same unity in America that you would have had, say, in a medieval society. I mean, there's trade-offs for that position. And also, in early America, and by that I kind of mean before the 20th century, there was an agreed recognition on God on all parties, which shaped the culture, the general Christian culture. So even though, in theory, any religion was accepted, just the fact of the matter is the vast majority were Christian, and that gave a Christian culture to this country. You see it in the Declaration of Independence, where they say, we hold these truths to be self-evident, and it mentions a creator or God. If you were to ask most people today that, you'd have serious disagreements with that statement, because that statement is rooted in an understanding of natural law that the majority of this country, including the Supreme Court, has thrown out the window. So I see that some of the things that made the American Constitution in early America successful under threat in the current fights in the culture. I don't know if that answers your question, but.
Yeah, I think that
Okay. Any other questions?
Back there.
Since all political systems are flawed, which one do you think is best, in your opinion?
Well, I'm American, so I'm going to say democracy. Aquinas said the best form of government is a good king, and the worst form of government is a bad king. So you're really taking your chances there. I mean, I think democracies have been very successful for a reason. They have their own risk. They have their own shortcomings. They can fall into factionalism. We see that in part today. But they also allow broad representation, and people's are heard by their government because they're able to vote. And it gives a great stability to it that you don't have under, say, a czarist Russia. And so I think overall, I would vote for democracy.
You had a question? There's no other. I want to take you all the way back to the beginning of your talk. You talked about when you talked about Adam and Eve.
Mm-hmm.
If you said something I had not heard put, I don't think I heard it put quite that way before. If the serpent was able to raise this question in their minds, or touch a doubt that God cared about them,
Mm-hmm.
Then why would they want to be like God? If they believe that He didn't care about them, why would they want to be like that?
Well, the way I see it, and this is my personal read on it, so this is not, in the catechism. My personal read on it is that he put the doubt, and they had to make the decision, do I follow God or not? And he put the doubt in there, well, does God really love you? Now, if they thought about it and thought, wait a minute, this question is premised on a lie right out of the gate, then they would have been in better shape than accepting that premise. But I think the desire to be like God was not thinking in the abstract, well, I want to be like God, a not entirely reliable divine being. I think it was, wait, God doesn't have my back. I better take things into my own hands. Whether I do good or bad, I just need to take care of myself.
So it's to be better than God.
Yeah, and that's
right. In that respect, it would be
root.
to be,
Yeah,
because they're going to care about themselves.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, he was the one. He was right there. Other questions? Questions are my favorite part, so feel free to ask questions.
Let me see if I can get this right. A few minutes ago, you were talking about the division in our country, and you talked about, after Roe v. Wade, about how people seem to get along with that. But if you look at it, is peaceful coexistence the best possibility that can come out? If a deeply evil thing is going on, where we see over 1 million human beings butchered every year.
Yes, you're right.
Then
it would be better if abortion were illegal and it never happened. You're absolutely right. So that's why I kept saying the near term, because it seems on the issues that really are pushing Christians out of the public square right now, the near term is the hope not to be crushed, the hope that it's not going to come to total war. But long term, that's why my hope's the new evangelization and the conversion of a culture. Because right now, even if we won politically, and the Supreme Court overturns Roe, and in fact, say it even goes further and says that that people have a constitutional right to live and there can be no abortion. Well, you're going to have an enormous amount of people defying that and seeking abortions anyway. That's still better to have that situation, but what ultimately changes it is the changing people's hearts.
That's
true.
true.
That's the real solution.
Okay.
So I'm not saying that I'm
Just
in
was
favor
hoping
of
we're not going to
abortion
leave
laws.
it at peaceful coexistence. And
No, that's not the goal. That's not the ultimate goal. But near term,
Okay.
if we could pull back as a country from politics of total war, we'll be in a better place.
Another comment you made was that to quote the scripture, we wrestle not with flesh and blood, but with principalities and powers, and that whatever way the world sways in terms of all the evil and all the good as well, that we really don't control. Some things we seem to control, and other things we don't seem to control, both in our own personal lives and in the world around us. And the paradigm is not that we just sit around and say, well, you can't do anything about it. We engage where we can and fight for the good. But I guess what I'm asking of you is to what level do we find ourselves engaging in politics, perceiving what he was just saying about, I mean, there are terrible evils, and how do we fight evil? Do we fight fire with fire? Do we fight fire with water? And how do we go about that without becoming a political church? In other words, another political entity.
Yeah, I think that's right, in that the key to engaging politically is to know the limits of politics, to not ask too much out of human action. And it's not that you don't do anything politically or just don't care, because God made us as people meant to live in communities. Politics is a natural part of our humanity as social beings. And so it's not evil to engage in politics, but we can't ask more of politics than it can give. We can't ask it to fix our deepest problems as a people and as an individual. And so that's why I was trying to outline a framework to understand political action, and so that it can be rightly ordered, that it doesn't become the highest part of us, it doesn't become what we place our hope in, not so that we never engage in politics, but so that when we do engage it, it's rightly balanced with other more important and ancillary concerns in our lives. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, that's an easier way to put it. Yeah. Last chance. All right, we got one more.
Recently in the news, there was some talk about removing the, I think it's a Johnson rule. What's your opinion of that?
Honestly, I don't know a lot about it. What it takes away tax-exempt status for political speech, or what does it do? It reverses it. Okay, so that you're allowed to engage in political speech. All right. I don't know. I could just say from my standpoint, even if it were repealed, I wouldn't preach politics from the pulpit. It's not the place to engage in partisan politics. And I think to engage as a clergy member in partisan politics, you upset the whole framework I attempted to outline in this talk.
Still, by default, there's some things you can't avoid. I don't know if these things are going to be recorded, but the fact that as Catholics and Christians, we passionately believe, even as Christians and Catholics, we passionately believe in the right to life.
Yeah,
you're preaching a political point.
Well, yeah. So you're right.
Regardless whether you like it or not.
You're right that you can't take what I said in an absolute way. But I'll preach that abortion's wrong, but I wouldn't get up there and talk about which, specific policies in the pro-life movement or something like that. But if it touches on a core issue of human dignity, yeah, I'll talk about that. But I'm not going to talk about it as someone engaged in partisan politics. I'm going to talk about it on the level of principles we get from revelation and natural law. So even if I talk about something that has to be talked about from the pulpit, like the right to life, my whole framework for talking about it is on the level of principles based on religion and not direct action based upon someone who's a political actor. So yeah, I hope that answers your question.
Will your talk be available to the members of Congress?
It'll be on YouTube, and I'd be happy for them to watch it.
They ought to hear this.
I'll even go
They ought to
give
hear
it
this.
again to them.
Well, especially on that amendment. They ought to hear this.
Yeah.
That's an excellent point.
Well, thank you, everyone, and have a Merry